Paul's life is about to become the most chaotic roller coaster ride imaginable. 2 weddings, 2 brides, 1 impossible day. How did he end up promising "I do" to not 1, but 2 different women? And more importantly, how on earth does he think he can pull it off? But what happens when both brides start to suspect that something is amiss? When Emily and Kate discover the truth, will they confront Paul, or will they play along, turning his perfect plan into the ultimate game of cat and mouse? Get ready for a hilarious, unpredictable adventure that will keep you guessing and laughing until the very last page. But the biggest question remains: can Paul really pull off the impossible? Chapter 1. The double trouble begins. Paul's hands trembled as he stood before the mirror, the bow tie dangling uselessly in his fingers. The reflection staring back at him was not the confident groom he'd imagined, but a man teetering on the edge of panic. He let out a shaky breath, his thoughts a chaotic swirl as he fumbled with the tie for what felt like the 100th time. "Come on, Paul," he muttered under his breath, his eyes wide with anxiety. "You can do this. It's just 2 weddings. On the same day, with 2 different women. How hard can it be?" The mirror offered no comfort, reflecting back the absurdity of his situation in cold, unforgiving detail. His tuxedo, crisp and perfectly tailored, felt like it was strangling him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his usually neat hair was starting to stick to his skin. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Instead, it felt like he was about to walk into a minefield. Paul had always been a bit of a romantic, some might even say hopelessly so. He fell in love quickly and intensely, often before his brain could catch up to his heart. That's how he found himself here, caught between 2 incredible women, both of whom he had promised to marry. First, there was Emily. Sweet, dependable Emily, who had a smile that could light up the darkest room. Her wedding at Willow Creek Chapel was a picture of perfection, elegant, traditional, and planned down to the last detail. The kind of wedding Paul had always imagined for himself. Emily had a calming presence, a steady hand that grounded him when life got too chaotic. She was everything he thought he wanted in a partner: kind, caring, and completely in love with him. Then there was Kate, wild, unpredictable Kate, who had swept into Paul's life like a whirlwind and turned everything upside down. Her wedding at Sandpiper Beach Resort was the polar opposite of Emily's, a barefoot ceremony on the sand, the waves crashing behind them, and a live band playing rock anthems under the stars. Kate was spontaneous, adventurous, and always up for anything. She made Paul feel alive in a way he hadn't known was possible. She was everything he didn't know he was looking for, and he fell for her just as hard as he had for Emily. And now, in a moment of sheer madness, Paul had agreed to marry them both. On the same day, at venues that were only a mile apart, but might as well have been on different planets. Paul's mind raced as he tried to recall how he had ended up in this situation. It had all seemed so simple at the time. He loved Emily, and he loved Kate, and he didn't want to lose either of them. When they both proposed wedding dates that just so happened to fall on the same day, in venues close enough that he could technically attend both, Paul's brain had latched onto the idea like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. How hard can it be, he had thought. I'll marry Emily in the morning, then dash over to the beach and marry Kate in the afternoon. They'll never know. Except now, standing in front of the mirror, Paul realized just how insane that plan really was. "Paul, you ready in there?" Jack's voice cut through the fog of panic clouding his thoughts. Jack, his best man and longtime partner in crime, had been the one to encourage this lunacy in the first place. Jack was the kind of friend who thrived on chaos, who believed that life was a series of adventures just waiting to be had, and consequences were merely the price of admission. Just a sec." Paul called back, his voice cracking slightly. The bow tie was still a mess, hanging limply around his neck like a noose. He gave up trying to fix it, instead opting to simply tuck it under his collar and hope no one noticed. He had bigger problems to worry about. Jack pushed open the door, leaning casually against the frame, his grin wide and unapologetic. "Man, you look like you're about to walk into your own funeral. Cold feet already?" Paul shot him a look of pure desperation. "Cold feet? Jack, I'm about to commit the biggest mistake of my life. I've got 2 weddings, 2 brides, and less than 5 hours to pull this off without getting caught. If this goes wrong—" "Relax," Jack interrupted, clapping a reassuring hand on Paul's shoulder. "You've got this. We've been over the plan a million times. You're in and out of Willow Creek in 20 minutes, tops. Then we hightail it over to Sandpiper. You change in the car, and boom, beach wedding. You'll be married twice before you know it." Paul stared at his friend, wishing he could borrow even a fraction of Jack's reckless confidence. "Jack, nothing about this is simple. What if I mix up the vows? What if I say the wrong name? What if you stop worrying so much and just go with it?" Jack suggested, his grin never faltering. "You're overthinking this, buddy. Just keep your cool, follow the plan, and everything will be fine." Paul tried to believe him, but all he could see were the million ways this could go horribly wrong. Still, it was too late to back out now. He'd made his bed, and in a few short hours, he'd be lying in it twice. "Right, the plan," Paul muttered, more to himself than to Jack. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. "Let's do this." As they made their way down the hallway, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking to his own execution. The chapel was beautifully decorated with white roses and delicate ribbons, just as Emily had envisioned. The soft, lilting notes of the string quartet floated through the air, creating an atmosphere of serene perfection. It was the kind of wedding most people only dreamed of, and yet all Paul could think about was the ticking clock in his head. They reached the entrance to the chapel, where the guests were already seated, their heads turning expectantly as Paul appeared. He peeked through the door and saw Emily at the far end of the aisle, radiant in her lace gown, her face glowing with happiness. For a moment, all of Paul's worries melted away. This was why he was doing this, to make Emily happy. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and reality came crashing back. He pulled it out and saw a text from Jack. "Jack, you're up. Remember, 20 minutes, then run." Paul shoved the phone back into his pocket, took a deep breath, and nodded to the wedding coordinator. The music swelled, the doors swung open, and Paul began his walk down the aisle, each step feeling like it might be his last. "Stay calm, stick to the plan," Paul whispered under his breath, though it wasn't clear who he was trying to convince, himself or the guests. The ceremony began, and Paul did his best to focus on the officiant's words. But his mind kept drifting to Sandpiper Beach, where Kate was probably pacing, wondering where her groom was. He couldn't afford to be late. He couldn't afford to screw this up. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The officiant turned to Paul and asked, "Do you, Paul, take Emily to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" I do," Paul said, his voice trembling slightly. He caught himself just before he started to say Kate, his heart pounding as he realized how close he'd come to ruining everything. The officiant smiled and turned to Emily. "And do you, Emily, take Paul to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Emily said, her voice steady and full of love. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Paul leaned in to kiss Emily, but in his haste, he misjudged the distance and ended up kissing her nose instead. The guests chuckled, thinking it was a cute moment of nervousness, but Paul was mortified. He quickly corrected his mistake, planting a proper kiss on Emily's lips, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next wedding. As soon as the kiss was over, Paul turned to Jack, who was waiting at the back of the chapel, and gave him a barely perceptible nod. It was time for the getaway. Well, the first signs of trouble are here, right? How would you have handled this situation? Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the start of this crazy adventure. Chapter 2. The Second Ceremony Shuffle. Paul's heart raced as he and Jack dashed out of Willow Creek Chapel, the sound of applause still ringing in his ears. The clock was ticking, and he had less than 10 minutes to get to Sandpiper Beach Resort, change into his beach tux, and somehow pull off another wedding. If his life had a soundtrack, it would be something out of a heist movie, fast-paced, adrenaline pumping, and leading to an almost certain disaster. The sun was just beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the parking lot as they sprinted toward Jack's car. Paul felt like every muscle in his body was on fire, his tuxedo suddenly suffocating in the late afternoon heat. He wasn't just running out of time. He was running out of luck. "Get in," Jack shouted, yanking the car door open as Paul practically dove into the back seat. His tuxedo jacket got caught on the seatbelt, and he struggled to free himself, all the while cursing under his breath. Jack tossed a garment bag containing the beach tux into the back seat with him, and Paul tore it open like a man possessed. "Why did I ever think this was a good idea?" Paul muttered, yanking off his tuxedo jacket with one hand, while fumbling with the buttons of his shirt with the other. The car was already speeding out of the parking lot, and the jostling made the task even more impossible. "Because you're an idiot with a romantic streak a mile wide," Jack replied cheerfully, glancing at Paul through the rearview mirror. His grin was far too wide for Paul's comfort. "And you've got a serious case of can't say no to pretty girls." Paul groaned as he finally managed to wriggle out of his tuxedo shirt. "Yeah, well, remind me to punch you later for encouraging this." "Hey, it was either this or you end up breaking one of their hearts," Jack said, shrugging. "And as much as I love watching a good train wreck, I'm rooting for you, buddy." Paul shot Jack a glare, but it was hard to stay mad when he was contorting himself into a pretzel to get into the beach tux. The car hit a bump in the road, and Paul nearly knocked his head against the ceiling as he struggled to shove his legs into the too tight pants Kate had picked out. "These pants are ridiculous," Paul grumbled, trying to tug them up without ripping them. "Why do they feel like they're 2 sizes too small?" Jack snorted. "Probably because they are. You're supposed to be marrying Kate at a beach resort, not starring in a Tom Ford fashion show." Paul managed to button the pants, though they pinched at his waist. He grabbed the shirt and pulled it over his head, grimacing at the tacky tropical print that clashed horribly with the elegant attire he'd been wearing just moments ago. "At least it's not a Hawaiian shirt," Paul muttered, trying to focus on the silver lining. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror and groaned again. His hair was a mess, sticking up in all directions from the frantic undressing and redressing. Worse, there was still a faint smear of lipstick on his cheek from where Emily had kissed him. "Jack, hand me a tissue," Paul demanded, scrubbing at the lipstick stain like it was a cursed mark. "Chill out, man," Jack said, tossing him a tissue. "You're acting like you're about to get caught cheating on a math test." Paul shot him another glare. "That's because this is 100 times worse than a math test. If Kate sees this lipstick—" Jack waved him off, laughing. "Relax, she won't notice. And even if she does, just tell her it's from your mom. Women love that kind of sweet, thoughtful crap." Paul wasn't convinced, but he didn't have time to argue. They were almost at Sandpiper Beach Resort, and the familiar mix of panic and excitement began to churn in his stomach. He tossed the tissue aside and tried to straighten out the wrinkles in his shirt, though it was a losing battle. As they pulled up to the resort, the picturesque scene of the beach wedding came into view. White chairs were arranged in neat rows on the sand, and a floral arch adorned with tropical flowers swayed gently in the ocean breeze. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over everything and making the water shimmer like liquid gold. It would have been breathtakingly beautiful if Paul hadn't been fighting the urge to vomit from nerves. Kate was waiting by the arch, her bare feet sinking into the sand, looking as stunning as ever in her flowing beach wedding dress. Her hair was loose and windswept, the perfect embodiment of the carefree, adventurous spirit that had drawn Paul to her in the first place. But as she spotted Paul, her expression shifted from serene to slightly puzzled. "Paul, there you are," Kate called out, hurrying over to him with a wide smile. But as she got closer, she slowed down, her eyes narrowing as she took in his disheveled appearance. "What happened to you?" Traffic," Paul said, forcing a smile as he jogged up to her. "Crazy traffic." Kate frowned slightly, glancing over his shoulder at the empty road leading to the resort. "Traffic? But we're on an island. There's only one road." Paul's mind scrambled for an excuse, and he blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "Yeah, I know, but, there was this flock of seagulls. They blocked the road. You wouldn't believe it." Kate raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Seagulls?" "Very aggressive seagulls," Paul added, nodding earnestly. "But it's all good now. Let's get married." Kate stared at him for a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe his bizarre story. But then she laughed, shaking her head. "All right, if you say so. But if you get dive-bombed by a flock of angry birds during the ceremony, don't say I didn't warn you." Paul let out a relieved chuckle, thankful that Kate seemed to be taking his excuse in stride. "I'll keep that in mind." As the ceremony began, Paul tried to focus on the moment, but his mind kept drifting back to Willow Creek Chapel. Had anyone noticed he was missing yet? Was Emily starting to wonder where he'd gone? Every few seconds, he found himself checking his watch, calculating the time it would take to get back to the chapel before anyone grew suspicious. He couldn't afford to be late. He couldn't afford to screw this up. The officiant's voice droned on, and Paul forced himself to pay attention. This was Kate's moment, and he owed it to her to at least pretend he wasn't a total wreck. But as the officiant asked Paul if he took Kate to be his lawfully wedded wife, Paul almost said, "I do, Emily," before catching himself just in time. "I do," Paul said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. He hoped Kate hadn't noticed the slip-up, but the look in her eyes suggested otherwise. She smiled, but it was tinged with just a hint of suspicion. The ceremony continued without further incident, and when it was finally over, Paul breathed a sigh of relief. He'd made it through 2 weddings without completely screwing up. Now all he had to do was survive the receptions. But that was easier said than done. As the guests began to file out to the beach reception area, Paul found himself cornered by Kate's surfer friends, who insisted on taking him for a quick dip in the ocean to celebrate. They grabbed him by the arms before he could protest, dragging him toward the water with whoops of laughter. "Guys, wait. I don't think." Paul's protests were cut off as they tossed him into the waves, his feet flying out from under him as he hit the cold water with a splash. Salt water filled his mouth, and he sputtered as he tried to scramble to his feet, the weight of his wet tuxedo making it nearly impossible to move. "Welcome to married life, man," one of the surfers shouted, laughing as Paul struggled to regain his footing. The others joined in, their laughter echoing across the beach. Paul finally managed to stand, his wet clothes clinging to him like a second skin. He wiped the salt water from his eyes and glared at the surfers, who were still laughing and clapping him on the back. "Thanks," Paul muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Really appreciate it." Kate approached, a towel in hand, her laughter barely contained. "I warned you about those seagulls," she teased, handing him the towel. "Yeah, well, next time I'll bring an umbrella," Paul grumbled, trying to dry off as best he could. His once pristine beach tux was now a sopping mess, the tropical print a blur of colors as the water soaked through the fabric. Kate leaned in and kissed his cheek, her smile softening. "You're a good sport, Paul. I think you'll survive." Paul managed a weak smile, but his heart was still pounding. He was soaked to the bone, his tuxedo ruined, and he had a sinking feeling that the day was only going to get worse. But for now, he had to focus on getting through the reception without making a complete fool of himself. The beach reception was a lively affair, with a live band playing upbeat tunes and guests dancing barefoot in the sand. Tiki torches flickered in the evening breeze, casting warm, golden light over the festivities. It was the kind of carefree, laid-back party that perfectly suited Kate's personality, and Paul tried to relax and enjoy the moment. But as the night wore on, Paul found it increasingly difficult to keep up the charade. Every time someone congratulated him on his marriage to Kate, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, knowing that just a few miles away, Emily was probably receiving similar well wishes. At one point, Kate's father pulled Paul aside for a heart-to-heart. The man was a towering figure, all muscle and tan skin, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made Paul's blood run cold. "So, Paul," Kate's father began, his voice low and steady, "I hear you're a man who likes to live on the edge." Paul swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice from shaking. I guess you could say that." Kate's father nodded, his gaze piercing. "That's good. My daughter's not one for the quiet life. She needs someone who can keep up with her." Paul forced a smile, though his stomach churned with anxiety. "I'll do my best, sir." Kate's father stared at him for a long moment, then broke into a grin, clapping Paul on the shoulder with enough force to nearly knock the wind out of him. "You'll do fine, son. Just remember, Kate's got a wild side, but she's got a good heart. Treat her right, and you'll have nothing to worry about." Paul nodded, relief flooding through him. "Yes, sir, I will." Kate's father gave him one last pat on the back before wandering off to join the other guests, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. He was barely holding it together, but he couldn't let anyone see just how close he was to losing it. As the night wore on, Paul managed to avoid any further disasters, though he remained on edge the entire time. Every time Kate looked at him, he was convinced she could see through the facade that she knew he was hiding something. But if she did suspect anything, she didn't let on, instead keeping the conversation light and cheerful. Finally, as the last guests began to trickle out, Paul allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. He had made it through the day without completely falling apart. But as he glanced at his watch, he realized with a jolt that he was late for the wedding he'd left behind. His heart pounded in his chest as he excused himself from Kate, mumbling something about needing to check on a wedding surprise he'd planned. She smiled and let him go, and Paul quickly made his way back to Jack, who was waiting by the car, looking far too amused for Paul's liking. "Ready for round two?" Jack asked, grinning as Paul climbed into the passenger seat. "Let's just get this over with," Paul muttered, wiping the last of the sand from his clothes. He had no idea how he was going to explain his absence to Emily, but he had to try. As they sped back to Willow Creek Chapel, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he was hurtling toward disaster. The day had already been a whirlwind of chaos, and it was far from over. He had 2 weddings to survive, and if he could just make it through the night without getting caught, he might actually have a chance at pulling this off. But deep down, Paul knew that his luck was running out. Chapter 3. The Bride's Discovery. Paul was still catching his breath from the chaotic shuffle between the 2 ceremonies when he was hit by a revelation that sent a shiver down his spine. It turned out that Emily and Kate had a mutual friend, Sarah, a friendly, chatty woman who had been invited to both weddings. A woman who had no idea that the Pauls at both events were one and the same. Sarah was the sort of person who loved to share amusing anecdotes and coincidences, and it was precisely this well-meaning trait that set the gears of chaos in motion. After attending Emily's wedding at Willow Creek Chapel, Sarah headed over to the Sandpiper Beach Resort to celebrate with Kate. She had no clue what she was about to set in motion when she spotted Kate sipping a cocktail by the beachfront bar. "Kate, darling," Sarah exclaimed as she approached, her voice filled with the kind of enthusiasm only Sarah could muster. "What a gorgeous ceremony! And the sunset! Oh, It was perfect. Kate, who had been enjoying a brief moment of solitude after the whirlwind of the day, turned to greet Sarah with a warm smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I'm so glad you could make it." Sarah beamed, practically bouncing on her toes. "Oh, of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world. And you know what's funny? I just came from another wedding at Willow Creek Chapel, and the groom there looked so much like Paul. Isn't that the craziest thing? Same name and everything." Kate froze, her smile faltering. "Willow Creek? You mean the one with the doves and the harpist?" "Yes," Sarah replied, taking a sip of her drink. "And the groom's name was Paul, too. It's such a small world, isn't it?" Kate's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of suspicion and disbelief. Could it be possible? Was Paul really that insane? She tried to push the idea aside, but the gnawing doubt refused to leave her alone. "Wow, that's weird," Kate said slowly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But, I actually have to run. Thanks for telling me, Sarah." "Oh, sure. We'll catch up later." Sarah waved as Kate hurried away, completely oblivious to the bombshell she had just dropped. Kate's heart pounded as she walked away, her mind spinning with questions. She knew she needed to find out the truth, but she couldn't just march up to Paul and accuse him without any proof. Instead, she decided to make a phone call. She stepped away from the bustling reception, finding a quiet spot near the beach where she could think. She pulled out her phone and hesitated for a moment before dialing Emily's number. It felt strange calling another bride on her wedding day, but if her suspicions were correct, they had a lot more in common than just the date. The phone rang once, twice, and then Emily picked up. "Hello?" Emily's voice was cheerful, if a bit tired. "Emily, I know this sounds crazy, but where's your Paul right now?" Kate asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Paul? He's with the photographer," Emily replied, clearly puzzled. "Why?" Kate took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "Emily, I think our Pauls might be the same guy." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you serious?" Emily finally whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Dead serious," Kate said, her words heavy with the weight of the realization. "And I think we need to do something about it." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process what Kate was telling her. It seemed impossible. How could Paul be at 2 weddings on the same day, marrying 2 different women? But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Paul's strange behavior, his frequent absences, the way he always seemed to be in a hurry. It all made a twisted kind of sense. "Okay," Emily said, her voice steadying as she slipped into problem-solving mode. "But what do we do?" Kate was silent for a moment, her mind churning with possibilities. She wasn't the type to sit back and let things happen to her. She wanted to take control of the situation, but she also didn't want to confront Paul outright. If he thought he was getting away with this, she wanted him to keep thinking that, at least for a little while. "I think we should toy with him," Kate finally said, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Let's make him feel the full weight of his idiotic decision without actually revealing that we know the truth." Emily couldn't help but smile at the idea. It was both brilliant and deliciously satisfying. "All right, what do you have in mind?" The 2 women began to hatch a plan, each adding their own twist to the scheme. They knew that Paul was likely juggling the 2 weddings, running back and forth between venues to keep up the facade. It was time to turn up the heat and make his day as stressful as possible. They decided to start with small pranks, little annoyances that would throw Paul off balance without arousing too much suspicion. Emily would enlist her bridesmaids to delay Paul's departure from Willow Creek, while Kate would set up a series of tests for him at Sandpiper Beach, claiming they were part of a fun wedding tradition. It was a simple plan, but one that would quickly escalate as the day went on. And as Emily and Kate finalized their scheme, they couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Paul thought he was playing a clever game, but the real game had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Bride's Revenge. Paul had no idea that the women he had just married were now fully aware of his deceit. As he darted between the two wedding venues, juggling increasingly ridiculous demands from both sides, he was completely oblivious to the fact that his every move was being orchestrated by two brides with a score to settle. Back at Willow Creek Chapel, Emily's bridesmaids were in on the plan. They were a mischievous bunch, more than happy to assist in giving Paul a day he would never forget. The first order of business was to delay Paul's departure from the chapel, making sure he had as little time as possible to make it back to Sandpiper Beach without arousing suspicion. The moment Paul finished the ceremony with Emily, the bridesmaids swooped in with a flurry of requests. They insisted on taking extra photos, ones that required elaborate poses and constant adjustments. Paul was pulled from one side of the chapel to the other, forced to smile for the camera while his mind screamed at him to get out of there. "Paul, darling, can we just get one more shot with the whole wedding party?" Emily asked sweetly, her smile hiding the devilish glee she felt inside. Paul's smile was strained as he nodded. "Of course, honey. Anything for you." But as the minutes ticked by, Paul's anxiety grew. He kept glancing at his watch, knowing that he was already running behind schedule. He couldn't afford to be late. Kate would kill him if she knew he'd been delayed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the photographer announced that they were done. Paul practically bolted toward the door, only to be stopped by one of the bridesmaids, a woman with a wicked grin and a devious glint in her eye. "Paul, wait," she called out, rushing over to him. "We have a little emergency with the flower girl's dress. Could you come help us?" Paul froze, his heart sinking. Can't someone else?" "Oh, come on, Paul," Emily chimed in, her voice light and teasing. "You're the groom. You should be able to handle this, right?" Paul wanted to scream. He wanted to tear his hair out and run for the hills. But instead, he forced a smile and followed the bridesmaid into the side room where the flower girl was waiting. The emergency turned out to be nothing more than a loose ribbon on the flower girl's dress, something that could have easily been fixed by one of the bridesmaids. But they insisted that Paul be the one to do it, taking their time to help him figure it out. Every second felt like an eternity, and by the time Paul was finally able to leave, he was already 10 minutes behind schedule. He bolted out of the chapel, his heart pounding as he raced toward the car where Jack was waiting. "What took you so long?" Jack asked as Paul practically dove into the passenger seat. "Emily's bridesmaids," Paul grumbled, yanking off his tuxedo jacket and tossing it in the back seat. "They're evil. They wouldn't let me leave." Jack snorted. "Yeah, well, you're gonna have to pick up the pace if you want to make it back to the beach on time." Paul's heart sank as he realized just how late he was. He was supposed to be at Sandpiper Beach in 5 minutes, and it was at least a 15-minute drive. "Just step on it," he muttered, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "We've got to make up time." Jack didn't need any more encouragement. He floored the gas pedal, and the car sped out of the chapel parking lot, careening down the winding road that led to the beach. Paul's mind was racing just as fast as the car, trying to come up with an excuse for why he was running late. Meanwhile, at Sandpiper Beach, Kate was preparing for the next phase of the plan. She had roped in her surfer friends, a laid-back but mischievous group who were more than happy to help with the pranks. The first test involved sending Paul on a wild goose chase down the beach to find a lucky seashell that Kate claimed was part of a wedding tradition. The moment Paul arrived, still out of breath and disheveled from his rushed escape from Willow Creek, Kate greeted him with a wide smile. "Paul, you made it," she said, her voice filled with exaggerated cheer. "I have a little surprise for you." Paul's heart sank as he looked into her eyes, noticing the glint of mischief. "What kind of surprise?" he asked, his voice tight with dread. Kate gestured down the beach, where the waves lapped gently at the shore. "It's a little tradition we have here at Sandpiper. You have to find a special seashell on the beach. It's supposed to bring good luck to the marriage." Paul blinked, caught off guard by the sudden request. "A seashell?" Kate nodded, her smile never faltering. Yep, and it has to be the right one. White, with a swirl of pink in the middle. It's supposed to represent love and unity or something like that. Paul's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. He glanced down the beach, his eyes scanning the sand for any sign of the shell she was describing. But there were hundreds of shells scattered across the shore, and finding the right one would take ages. Do I really have to?" Paul began, but Kate cut him off with a laugh. "Come on, Paul. It's tradition," she said, giving him a playful shove. "It won't take long. Just a quick search, and then we can get back to the reception." Paul wanted to argue, but he knew he didn't have a choice. If he refused, Kate would get suspicious, and the last thing he needed was for her to start questioning his motives. With a resigned sigh, he turned and began trudging down the beach, his eyes scanning the sand for the elusive shell. Kate watched him go, her smile widening as she exchanged a glance with one of her surfer friends. "This is going to be fun," she whispered, barely able to contain her laughter. As Paul scoured the beach, desperately searching for the shell that probably didn't even exist, the surfers took the opportunity to start the next prank. They gathered around the reception area, pretending to prepare for a toast, but in reality, they were waiting for the right moment to strike. When Paul finally returned, his hands empty and his expression frazzled, Kate greeted him with a mock frown. "No luck?" she asked, her voice dripping with faux disappointment. Paul shook his head, trying to hide his frustration. "I couldn't find it. I looked everywhere, but—" Kate's frown deepened, and she placed a hand on her chin as if deep in thought. That's too bad. I guess we'll just have to make do without it." Paul nodded, relieved that the search was over. But before he could catch his breath, one of the surfers called out to him. "Hey, Paul, come over here," the surfer shouted, holding up a bottle of champagne. "We're about to do a toast." Paul's stomach dropped as he realized he was about to be roped into yet another delay. But he had no choice. He had to keep up appearances. With a forced smile, he made his way over to the group, trying to ignore the sense of dread that was building in his chest. The surfer handed him a glass of champagne, and Paul accepted it with a shaky hand. He raised the glass to his lips, ready to take a sip, but before he could, the surfer spoke up again. "Wait, Paul. You can't just drink it like that," the surfer said, grinning from ear to ear. "You've got to chug it in one go. It's tradition." Paul's heart sank as he looked at the full glass of champagne in his hand. He wasn't much of a drinker, and the thought of chugging an entire glass of champagne made his stomach turn. But with the entire group watching him expectantly, he knew he had no choice. With a deep breath, Paul tipped the glass back and chugged the champagne, the bubbles burning his throat as he forced it down. The surfers cheered as he finished the glass, clapping him on the back with enough force to make him stumble. Paul tried to smile, but the champagne was already starting to make his head spin. He was barely holding it together, and the night was far from over. He just needed to survive a little longer, long enough to get through the reception without arousing any more suspicion. But the surfers weren't done with him yet. They grabbed him by the arms and dragged him over to the dance floor, where they proceeded to teach him a ridiculous dance that involved a lot of hip shaking and awkward footwork. Paul did his best to keep up, but the combination of exhaustion, stress, and champagne left him stumbling over his own feet. The guests, initially confused by the sudden turn of events, quickly caught on to the fact that Paul was the target of some elaborate joke. They joined in the fun, laughing and clapping as Paul struggled to keep up with the surfers' antics. By the time the dance was over, Paul was panting and drenched in sweat. His shirt clung to his skin, his hair was a mess, and he was certain he looked like he'd been through a war zone. But at least the pranks seemed to be winding down. As the night wore on, Paul found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise and flinching whenever someone approached him. He was certain that at any moment, Kate would pull another prank, or Emily's bridesmaids would show up with another emergency. But the pranks seemed to stop as the reception began to wind down. Kate finally let Paul off the hook, wrapping an arm around his waist and leaning her head on his shoulder. "You did good today, Paul," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "I know it was a lot, but you handled it like a champ." Paul managed a weak smile, though his exhaustion was beginning to overtake him. "Thanks, Kate. I just want to make you happy." Kate's smile softened, and she gave him a gentle squeeze. "You already have. I'm so glad we're in this together." Paul nodded, relieved that the chaos seemed to be over. But as they walked off the dance floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't quite finished with him yet. Chapter 5. The Pranks Escalate. The sun had long since set, casting a dark, velvety blanket over the beach as the final hours of the reception ticked by. The tiki torches flickered in the cool evening breeze, their golden flames dancing against the backdrop of the star-studded sky. The party was winding down, but the energy in the air was still electric, fueled by the laughter and excitement of the guests. Paul, on the other hand, was barely holding it together. The events of the day had taken their toll, leaving him exhausted, disheveled, and more than a little paranoid. Every time someone so much as looked in his direction, his heart skipped a beat, convinced that another prank was about to be sprung on him. He'd been right so far. The pranks hadn't stopped. If anything, they were escalating. Back at Willow Creek, Emily had enlisted the help of her cousins, mischievous, prank-loving cousins who were more than happy to assist in giving Paul a night he'd never forget. They had pulled him aside under the guise of needing his help with another wedding emergency, only to lead him on a wild goose chase around the chapel. "Paul, we need your help," one of the cousins, a lanky teenager with a devilish grin, had called out. "There's a cat stuck in the tree behind the chapel." Paul had been in the middle of trying to sneak away when the cousin cornered him, desperation in his voice. "A cat? In a tree? Can't someone else?" "Please, Paul," the cousin begged, his eyes wide with fake concern. "It's a wedding emergency." Paul had groaned inwardly, knowing that he couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. So, he had reluctantly followed the cousin outside, his heart sinking as he realized he was being led further and further away from the chapel. When they finally reached the tree, Paul had stared up at the branches, squinting into the darkness. "Where's the cat?" The cousin had pointed up into the branches, a grin spreading across his face. "Up there. Can't you see it?" Paul had squinted harder, but there was no cat, just a lot of leaves and darkness. He had turned to the cousin, about to protest, when a sudden rustling in the bushes behind him made him jump. "It's over here," the cousin had shouted, dashing toward the bushes with an exaggerated sense of urgency. Paul had groaned again, running after the cousin in a futile attempt to catch up. But every time he got close, the cousin would dart off in another direction, leading him on a wild goose chase around the chapel grounds. By the time Paul had finally caught up to the cousin, out of breath and drenched in sweat, the cat had mysteriously vanished. The cousin had shrugged, offering a half-hearted apology before wandering off, leaving Paul to wonder if there had ever been a cat in the first place. The answer, of course, was no. But Paul didn't have time to dwell on it. He had to get back to Sandpiper Beach before Kate started to wonder where he'd gone. As he sprinted back to the car, his mind raced with a mix of panic and frustration. He was being pulled in every direction, and he was barely managing to keep up. The pranks were relentless, each one designed to push him closer to the edge. And yet, he couldn't let himself break. He had to keep up the facade, no matter how absurd things got. Meanwhile, at Sandpiper Beach, Kate was preparing for the next round of pranks. She had roped in her surfer friends, a laid-back but mischievous group who were more than happy to help with the chaos. The first prank had involved sending Paul on a wild goose chase down the beach to find a lucky seashell that Kate claimed was part of a wedding tradition. Paul had returned empty-handed, his frustration barely concealed, only to be roped into yet another prank involving a ridiculous dance with the surfers. But Kate wasn't done with him yet. She had one more prank up her sleeve, a prank that involved the entire wedding party. The idea was simple: create a fake emergency that would force Paul to run back and forth between the two venues, each time arriving just in time to be hit with another prank. The goal was to leave him so frazzled and exhausted that he wouldn't know which way was up. The first step was to create a fake crisis at Willow Creek, a fire in the chapel that required Paul's immediate attention. Emily's cousins were more than happy to play along, setting off a smoke machine in the back of the chapel and calling for help. When Paul arrived, panting and out of breath, he was met with a scene of chaos. The cousins were running around, waving their arms and shouting about the fire, while Emily's bridesmaids did their best to look concerned. "Paul, thank God you're here," one of the bridesmaids shouted, rushing over to him with wide eyes. "There's a fire in the chapel. You have to do something." Paul's heart sank as he looked toward the chapel, half expecting to see flames licking at the walls. But all he saw was a faint haze of smoke drifting out of the back door, a haze that smelled suspiciously like dry ice. "Where's the fire?" Paul asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Back there," one of the cousins shouted, pointing toward the smoke machine. "We can't get it to stop." Paul hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Something didn't feel right. This whole situation felt off. But before he could voice his doubts, another cousin grabbed his arm, practically dragging him toward the back of the chapel. As they approached the source of the fire, Paul's suspicions grew. The smoke was thick, but it wasn't acrid or choking like real smoke would be. It was just there, drifting lazily through the air as if it had no real purpose. "What is this?" Paul asked, narrowing his eyes at the cousins. "Just a little wedding surprise," one of the cousins shouted, grinning from ear to ear. "Gotcha." Paul stared at them, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had been duped again. But this time, it was worse. This time, he had been dragged into a fake emergency that had wasted precious time he didn't have. "Are you kidding me?" Paul shouted, his frustration finally boiling over. "I don't have time for this." The cousins just laughed, clearly pleased with themselves. "Relax, Paul. It's all in good fun." But Paul wasn't in the mood for fun. He was late again. He had to get back to Sandpiper Beach before Kate started asking questions. He spun on his heel and stormed back to the car, his mind racing with a mix of panic and anger. When he arrived at Sandpiper Beach, the scene was eerily calm. The surfers were lounging around, sipping drinks and chatting as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Paul knew better. He knew that they were up to something. And he was right. As soon as Paul stepped onto the beach, one of the surfers called out to him, waving a hand in the air. "Hey, Paul, over here." Paul groaned inwardly, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. "What now?" he muttered, forcing a smile as he approached the group. The surfers exchanged mischievous grins before one of them spoke up. "We've got a little game for you, Paul. It's called Beach Ball Blitz." Paul's heart sank as he looked at the group of surfers, their expressions a mix of excitement and mischief. "Beach Ball Blitz?" "Yep," one of the surfers replied, tossing a bright yellow beach ball into the air. "All you have to do is keep the ball in the air for 5 minutes. Easy, right?" Paul's mind raced as he tried to come up with an excuse to get out of the game. But before he could say anything, another surfer tossed the ball to him, and he had no choice but to catch it. The next 5 minutes were a blur of chaos. Paul was forced to run around the beach, trying to keep the ball in the air as the surfers deliberately made it as difficult as possible. They spiked the ball, kicked it, and even threw in a few fake-outs just to mess with him. By the time the game was over, Paul was panting and drenched in sweat. His shirt was soaked through, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his legs felt like they were made of jelly. But the surfers weren't done with him yet. As Paul stood there, trying to catch his breath, one of the surfers grinned and pointed toward the water. "Hey, Paul, how about a quick swim?" Paul's heart sank as he looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the shore. The last thing he wanted to do was get wet again, especially after the disaster with the beach tux. But the surfers were already grabbing him by the arms, dragging him toward the water before he could protest. "Come on, Paul. It's tradition," one of the surfers shouted, laughing as they waded into the water. Paul had no choice but to follow, his heart sinking with every step. The water was cold, the waves rough as they crashed against his legs. He shivered as the water soaked through his clothes, his teeth chattering as he tried to keep his balance. The surfers, of course, had no such problems. They were in their element, laughing and splashing each other as if they were on a casual beach day instead of a wedding reception. "Is this really necessary?" Paul shouted over the sound of the waves, his voice tight with frustration. "Absolutely," one of the surfers replied, grinning as he splashed Paul with a wave of water. "It's all part of the experience." Paul wanted to scream. He wanted to throw the surfers into the ocean and leave them there. But he couldn't. He had to keep up the facade, no matter how ridiculous things got. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surfers let Paul go, laughing as they made their way back to the beach. Paul followed them, his clothes soaked and his body shivering from the cold. He was utterly exhausted, physically and mentally. The day had been a never-ending series of pranks, each one more absurd than the last. And yet, he couldn't let himself break. He had to keep up the facade, no matter how much it cost him. As he walked back to the reception area, his mind racing with a mix of frustration and exhaustion, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep this up. The pranks were relentless, each one designed to push him closer to the edge. And yet, he couldn't let himself break. He had to keep up the facade, no matter how absurd things got. But deep down, Paul knew that his luck was running out. Chapter 6. The Final Fiasco. The night was reaching its chaotic crescendo. The stars twinkled innocently above, utterly oblivious to the pandemonium unfolding below. The beach at Sandpiper Resort, now only partially lit by the flickering tiki torches, was littered with the remnants of a party that had spiraled into absurdity. Guests were still laughing and dancing, but the energy had shifted. There was a sense that something spectacularly ridiculous was about to happen. Paul, however, was anything but calm. He was drenched, both in sweat and seawater, exhausted, and on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The day's relentless pranks had pushed him to the edge of sanity. If this wedding marathon had been a test of endurance, he was teetering dangerously close to failure. As Paul trudged back up the beach from his unexpected ocean dip, he couldn't help but feel like a soggy, miserable mess. His clothes were clinging to him like a second skin, and his once dapper appearance was now a distant memory. His hair, once meticulously styled, was plastered to his forehead in a tangled mess of seaweed and sand. "Just a little longer," Paul muttered to himself, trying to muster what little strength he had left. "Just get through the night, and you can collapse in peace." But deep down, he knew that the night wasn't going to let him off that easily. As he made his way back to the reception area, he spotted Kate and her surfer friends huddled together near the bar, their heads bent in conspiratorial whispers. Kate caught his eye and shot him a mischievous grin that sent a shiver down his spine. He knew that look all too well. It was the look of someone who had one last prank up her sleeve. "Paul, come over here," Kate called out, waving him over with a wide smile. Paul forced a smile, though his heart was pounding with dread. "Sure, Kate," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's up?" Kate wrapped an arm around his waist, pulling him close as she whispered in his ear. "We have a little surprise for you." Paul's stomach dropped. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" Kate's grin widened, and she gestured toward the other end of the beach, where a small, rickety-looking rowboat was bobbing in the waves. "We're going on a little boat ride. Just you, me, and a couple of friends." Paul's eyes widened in horror as he took in the sight of the boat. It looked like it had been through one too many storms, with peeling paint and a visible crack along the side. The idea of getting into that death trap made his heart skip a beat, and not in a good way. Are you sure that's safe?" Paul asked, his voice wavering. Kate laughed, a carefree sound that only deepened his dread. "Of course it's safe. Don't be such a worrywart. It'll be fun." Paul wanted to protest, but before he could say anything, Kate was already dragging him toward the boat, her surfer friends following close behind. The guests cheered and clapped as they made their way to the water, completely oblivious to the fact that Paul was mentally preparing his will. As they reached the boat, one of the surfers handed Paul an oar, grinning from ear to ear. "Here you go, man. You'll be our captain for the evening." Paul stared at the oar, his hands trembling as he took it. "Captain? I don't even know how to row a boat." Kate gave him a playful shove, nearly knocking him off balance. "Relax, Paul. It's just a short trip. We'll be back before you know it." Paul's mind raced as he clambered into the boat, his heart pounding in his chest. The boat rocked dangerously as he took his seat, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a terrible idea. But with Kate and the surfers all watching him expectantly, he had no choice but to go along with it. As soon as everyone was seated, Kate handed him the second oar and shot him a challenging look. "Let's see what you've got, Captain." Paul forced a grin, though it felt more like a grimace. "Sure thing," he said, trying to sound confident as he dipped the oars into the water. The boat wobbled precariously as he began to row, and he had to fight to keep it from tipping over. The guests cheered as the boat pulled away from the shore, but Paul's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. His arms ached with every stroke, and the boat seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. Worse, the waves were getting rougher the further they went, and the boat creaked ominously with each rise and fall. "How much further?" Paul asked, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Kate, who was sitting at the front of the boat with a serene smile, shrugged. "Just a little further." "You're doing great, Paul." Paul bit back a groan as he continued to row, his muscles burning with the effort. The boat was bobbing up and down like a cork in a washing machine, and he could feel the cold seawater sloshing around his feet as it seeped through the crack in the hull. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kate signaled for him to stop. Paul let out a sigh of relief as he rested the oars in the boat, his arms trembling from the exertion. "This is it," Kate said, her voice filled with excitement. "Time for the grand finale." Paul's heart sank as he looked around. "Grand finale? What are you talking about?" Kate's grin widened as she pulled out a small box from behind her back. "Fireworks!" she exclaimed, holding up the box for him to see. "We're going to set off some fireworks to celebrate the end of the day." Paul stared at the box, his mind reeling. "Fireworks? On a boat? Are you insane?" Kate laughed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Oh, come on, Paul. Live a little. It'll be fun." Paul wanted to argue, but before he could say anything, Kate was already lighting the first fuse. The boat rocked violently as the fireworks shot into the sky with a deafening whoosh, exploding in a brilliant display of colors. The guests on the beach cheered and clapped as the fireworks lit up the night, but Paul was too busy trying to keep the boat from capsizing to enjoy the show. The waves were getting rougher by the second, and he could feel the boat sinking lower and lower in the water. "Kate, I think we should head back," Paul shouted over the noise of the fireworks. "The boat's not going to hold." But Kate was too caught up in the excitement to listen. She lit another fuse, sending another firework screaming into the sky. The boat lurched to the side as the wave hit, and Paul had to grab the edge to keep from being thrown overboard. "Kate!" Paul shouted again, his voice filled with panic. "We need to go back. Now." But it was too late. The boat had taken on too much water, and with one final creak, it began to sink. Paul barely had time to react before he was thrown into the icy water, the world spinning around him as he struggled to stay afloat. The guests on the beach gasped in shock as they watched the boat go under, but the surfers quickly jumped into action. They dove into the water, swimming out to help Paul and Kate as the boat disappeared beneath the waves. Paul sputtered and gasped as he tried to keep his head above water, his arms flailing as he searched for something to hold on to. But the waves were relentless, crashing over him again and again, pushing him further from the shore. Just when he thought he was done for, one of the surfers grabbed his arm, pulling him up and onto a surfboard. Paul clung to the board for dear life, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion. "Hang on, man," the surfer shouted, paddling them both back to shore. "We've got you." Paul barely heard him over the sound of his own heartbeat, but he nodded weakly, too tired to do anything else. The journey back to the beach felt like it took hours, but finally, they made it to the shallows, where the guests rushed to help pull them onto dry land. As soon as Paul was out of the water, he collapsed onto the sand, his chest heaving with every breath. He was soaked, shivering, and utterly spent. The guests crowded around him, their faces filled with concern and disbelief. Kate, who had managed to swim back to shore on her own, knelt beside him, her expression a mix of guilt and amusement. "Paul, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I didn't think it would go that far." Paul looked up at her, his eyes wide with shock. "Kate, we almost drowned." Kate winced, nodding sheepishly. "Yeah, that might have been a bit much." "A bit much?" Paul echoed, his voice rising with disbelief. "A bit much? We sank a boat." The guests, sensing the tension, began to murmur among themselves, but Paul barely noticed. He was too busy trying to process what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kate let out a small laugh. "Okay, maybe it was more than a bit much," she admitted. "But you have to admit, it was kind of epic." Paul stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. But before he could say anything, he was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Paul, are you okay?" Emily's voice cut through the chaos, and Paul turned to see her pushing her way through the crowd, her face filled with worry. Paul's heart sank as he realized that Emily had witnessed the whole thing. "Emily, But before he could explain, Emily knelt beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "It's okay, Paul," she said softly. "I know." Paul blinked, confusion and panic flooding his mind. "You know? You know what?" Emily smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "About everything. About the 2 weddings. About you trying to juggle both of us today." Paul's heart stopped. He stared at her, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. You know?" Emily nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, Paul. We've known all day, and we decided to have a little fun with it." Paul felt the ground shift beneath him as the truth finally sunk in. They knew. They had known the whole time. All the pranks, all the ridiculous challenges. It had all been a game, a way to mess with him while they played along. And as he looked between Emily and Kate, both of them smiling at him with a mix of affection and amusement, he couldn't help but laugh. It was a wild, incredulous laugh, one that bubbled up from deep within him and refused to be held back. "You knew," Paul said again, his voice breathless with disbelief. "You both knew." Kate nodded, her grin widening. "And we decided to give you the day of your life." Paul shook his head, still laughing as he collapsed back onto the sand. "I can't believe it. I can't believe I didn't see it coming." Emily chuckled, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "You were too busy running around to notice. But don't worry, Paul, we're not mad. We just wanted to make sure you'd never forget today." Paul's laughter finally began to subside, and he looked up at them with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "Well, you definitely succeeded. I don't think I'll ever forget this day." The guests, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and curiosity, began to applaud, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. It was a surreal moment, one that perfectly encapsulated the absurdity of the entire day. As the applause died down, Paul pushed himself up onto his elbows, still shaking his head in disbelief. "So, what happens now?" Kate and Emily exchanged a glance, then smiled at him in unison. "Now," Emily said, taking his hand, "we go back to the reception and we celebrate the rest of the night together." Kate nodded, slipping her arm around his waist. "No more pranks, no more games. Just us, enjoying the rest of our wedding day." Paul looked between them, his heart swelling with affection. Despite everything that had happened, despite the chaos and the pranks and the near-drowning experience, he realized that he wouldn't change a thing. These were the women he loved, and they had shown him that love could survive even the most absurd circumstances. With a deep breath, Paul got to his feet, pulling Emily and Kate up with him. He was soaked, exhausted, and still a little shell-shocked, but he felt lighter than he had all day. "All right," Paul said, his voice steady. "Let's go celebrate." The three of them made their way back to the reception area, the guests following close behind. The music resumed, the laughter returned, and for the first time that night, Paul allowed himself to relax. The pranks were over, the truth was out, and now it was time to enjoy the rest of the evening. As they danced together under the stars, surrounded by their friends and family, Paul couldn't help but smile. The day had been an absolute disaster in every conceivable way, but it had also been unforgettable. And as the night drew to a close, he realized that he wouldn't have it any other way. Because sometimes, love isn't about perfection. It's about surviving the chaos, the absurdity, and the challenges that life throws your way. And in the end, it's those moments of insanity that make the journey worthwhile. Epilogue: A new beginning. In the end, the combined wedding was a smashing success. The two receptions blended seamlessly into one, with everyone dancing and laughing late into the night. Paul, thoroughly exhausted but undeniably happy, found himself at peace with the absurdity of the day. As the last guests finally left and the lights began to dim, Paul, Emily, and Kate stood together, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight. "So, what's next?" Paul asked, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Emily smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Who knows? But whatever it is, we'll face it together." Kate nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Yeah, and no more double weddings, okay?" Paul laughed, hugging them both tightly. "Deal." And as they walked off into the night, Paul knew that whatever challenges the future held, they'd tackle them as a team, because after surviving a day like this, anything else would be a piece of cake.